Right, the last part here, 6.6. This is the only section I haven't tried to make like 5 or 6 times. So I actually don't know how long it's going to be, but I think this will be the shortest for sure. So this one is conditions of special parallelograms. So it's kind of like the converse of everything we did in the last section. So the last section was basically saying if you have a rhombus, you know the diagonals are perpendicular, you know the diagonals bisect opposite angles. If you have a rectangle, you know the diagonals are congruent. And this one is going in reverse. It's basically saying if you have a if you have a parallelogram with diagonals that are congruent, then it's a rhombus. If you have diagonals that bisect opposite angles, then that parallelogram is a rhombus. If you have diagonals that are congruent, then that parallelogram is a rectangle. Okay, so it's kind of like the converse. It is the converse of each of those theorems and properties we did in the last section. So start with the first one here. We're simply identifying what these are. Okay. So the first one, they're showing, it's hard to see maybe on this, but on your screen you should see it pretty clearly. We have diagonals bisecting each other. That's just telling us it's a parallelogram, but we already know that. They're telling us each of these is a parallelogram. We just have to classify what type of parallelogram. But they're telling us the diagonals are perpendicular. That right angle is telling us diagonals are perpendicular. So if we look back a slide, if the diagonals are perpendicular, then our parallelogram is a rhombus. Okay, so this one would be a rhombus. Right? Because diagonals are perpendicular. The right angle tells us the diagonals are perpendicular. Okay, the second one, it's a parallelogram. So if we have one hash mark, it's hard to see on mine, but again on yours you should see it clearly. If you have one hash mark here, we know in a parallelogram opposite sides are congruent. So this is also going to have one hash mark. And then across here, you're also going to have a hash mark. So since we have 4 right angles, we have a rhombus. Okay, but we also know in a parallelogram, consecutive angles are supplementary. And so we have a right angle. Well, 180 minus 90 is going to be 90. Right? 180 minus 90 is 90. 180 minus 90 is 90. So we have 4 right angles. So since we have 4 right angles, we have a rectangle. And since it's both a rectangle and a rhombus, it's a square. Okay, the question is asking for the best classification. So the best class, all 3 of these are true, all 3 of these are accurate, but the best classification is a square. Right? Because you have 4 congruent sides, so it's a rhombus, and 4 right angles, so it's a rectangle. And since it's both a rectangle and a rhombus, it's a square. Third one, same idea here with the angles. Since it's a parallelogram, consecutive angles are supplementary, so we know this is 90, so we know this is 90, so we know this is 90. And so 4 right angles is a rectangle. So we have a rectangle, right, because 4 right angles, right? So you have to write that in, because you have 4 right angles. Rectangle because you have 4 right angles. Okay, and let me scroll up for 4, 5, and 6. All right, 4, 5, and 6 here. Number 4, this is kind of just like what we did for number 2. You have one side here. So opposite sides are congruent, so you put 1 hash mark there. This side's got 1 hash mark, so you put 1 more hash mark on across from it. And so you have 4 congruent sides. That is a rhombus. 4 congruent sides, or because it has 4 congruent sides. Okay. Number 5, they're telling us all 4 of those little pieces there are congruent. Therefore, since these 2 are the same and these 2 are the same, we know that those diagonals are going to be the same length. So this is a rectangle because the diagonals are congruent. Your diagonals are congruent, therefore it's a rectangle. Number 6, same thing. Diagonals are congruent, so it's a rectangle. But they also tell us that our diagonals are perpendicular. That's going to make it a rhombus. So because the diagonals are perpendicular, it's a rhombus. Because the diagonals are congruent, it's a rectangle. And since it's both a rectangle and a rhombus, we are going to say that the best, that's way up there now, but the best description is a square. Right? Because it's a rectangle because the diagonals are congruent, and it's a rhombus because the diagonals are perpendicular, so it's therefore both a rectangle and a rhombus, which means the best description is a square. All right, next question here. So, we have a rectangle. Okay, we're looking for the value of x. Since this is a rectangle, we know that angles here are right angles, 4 right angles. So 4x minus 12 plus x plus 2 should equal 90 degrees. Right? These two small angles should add up to 90. So we combine like terms. I have 5x here. Minus 12 and plus 2, that's going to be a minus 10. That equals 90. I add 10 to both sides, so that's going to be 5x is 100. And then I divide both sides by 5, so I get x equals 20. So 20. But I will probably want to check my answer first. So 4 times 20 minus 12. That's 80 minus 12 is going to be 68. And then 20 plus 2 is 22. 22 plus 68 gives me 90. So I know 20 here is my right answer. Right. For what value of x is the quadrilateral a rhombus? So if this is a rhombus, the diagonals are going to bisect the opposite angles. That means these two pieces are going to have to be equal. So 3x minus 2 is going to have to be equal to 2x plus 16. So we're going to find the value of x for which those two expressions are equal. We can subtract 2x from both sides. That gives us x minus 2 equals 16. We can add 2 to both sides. So we get x equals 18. It's always good to check your answer, so let's substitute it in. 3 times 18 minus 2. 54 minus 2 is 52. 2 times 18 plus 16. That's 36 plus 16. 36, 50, or 42, 52. So 52. So we're good. 18 is your final answer. Right, and then last one. Last one here. Okay. This is a square. For what value of x is the quadrilateral a square? So if this is a square, like we just said at the very beginning, all of these angles are 45, right? 45, 45. Right, you have right angles, because it's a rectangle. Square is a rectangle, so these add up to 90. Right angles in the corner. And since it's a rhombus, you're bisecting those 90-degree angles, so 45, 45. So we know 7x plus 3 is 45. So we subtract 3. We get 7x equals 42. So x is going to be equal to 6. Okay, and that's the review. I think this review is much more difficult than what actually is on the test. But if you can do everything on here, you should be able to fly through and ace the test.